Good morning. For those of you who may not know me, I'm Charlie Bryan. Been a resident here almost 7 years. Can you hear? Some said yes, some said no. That's the reason I'm not giving this talk. I originally had planned on doing it, but my throat won't allow me to speak too loudly. But today we have an interesting program that I think you will find interesting. I was in the museum field for more than 30 years. And you ask somebody like me or Jim Kelly, what are the most exciting moments in being a curator? It sounds like it might be pretty dull, but it's anything but dull. Today is a perfect example of that, of a collection that was far more valuable in many ways than anyone had thought. And when I decided I could not give this talk, I immediately thought of Jim Kelly, who I have known for nearly 50 years. We were in Nashville. I worked at the Hermitage home of Andrew Jackson, and Jim worked at the time at the Tennessee State Museum. And we got to be good friends then. And this guy is amazing in what he has done in the field. The thing that impressed me most was his interpretation in the history of Tennessee. And I always admired him for that. When I came to the Virginia Historical Society, I wanted to have something that had never existed before. And that is a Museum of Virginia History. We were one of only 2 states to not have that, all of the state's history under one roof. And I knew who I wanted to do that for Virginia. And I called on Jim Kelly, and he fortunately decided to come. And the Virginia Historical Society and the history of Virginia is largely Jim's work. And it has been a huge success. It's one of the best hires I've ever made. But Jim, eventually, in his last 10 years, he spent as chief curator, I think, of the U.S. Army Museum System, which has the largest system of museums in existence. But I don't want to take any more of his time with my scratchy voice. So let me say one last thing. Jim was born and raised in Philadelphia, graduated from Temple University, and received his PhD in history from Vanderbilt University. And it was a lucky move for the South that he came south. But now it's my pleasure to turn the program over to Dr. Jim Kelly. Jim.
Thank you, Charlie. I thought you were going to include my most important exhibit that I ever curated, which was the one on the first 25 years of the history of Cedarfield. That's upstairs, or is it on this floor? Anyway, 4th floor. Go take a look if you haven't seen it. Charlie was, when Cedarfield, I think it was 2021, had its 25th anniversary, they wanted to do an exhibit on the history of the place here. And they knew they had a prominent museum director living here, so they went to Charlie and they asked him to design their exhibit for them. And he said, I just raise the money to build exhibits. I don't actually do the exhibits myself. He said, I have to put you off onto somebody else. So anyway, he put them off onto me and to a couple of other former employees of the Virginia Historical Society, and we worked on the exhibit that's here. All right, I'm here today to talk about Robert Knox Sneeden and his remarkable collection that came to the Virginia Historical Society, now called the Virginia Museum of History and Culture, back when Charlie was the director there. But before I get into the actual slides showing you the work of this artist and diarist, I want to tell you the story, the fascinating story about how we acquire these collections, because that story is about as interesting as the diaries themselves. Sneeden, this Civil War soldier born in 1832, died in 1918 at the age of 86. And he had created these scrapbooks with hundreds and hundreds of watercolors that he drew of his experiences in the Civil War, mostly in Virginia. Well, when he died in 1918, the scrapbooks were left to a nephew. And then the Charles Ashe family inherited or acquired the Sneeden scrapbooks from that nephew. They were collateral for a loan in the 1930s, and when the nephew could not redeem the loan, they remained in the Ashe family, and they were in a Connecticut bank vault until 1993, so for more than half a century. Then the Ashe family decided, hey, we'd like to sell these, and so they went appropriately to a well-known dealer in Southern art, because most of the images were of Virginia and other southern states. So they went to Robert Hicklin, who was a well-known antiques dealer in Charleston, South Carolina. I'd known Mr. Hicklin since the late 1970s when I was curator at the Tennessee State Museum in Nashville. And so he knew now that Charlie had brought me up to Richmond to the Virginia Historical Society. So he came by and he brought these scrapbooks with him. And they came in a battered old suitcase. And he opened them up and he showed them to me. And I had to make an effort to contain my enthusiasm. I clearly instantly impressed by what I was seeing, but of course it's not good business to show too much enthusiasm for something when someone's trying to sell it to you. That might drive the price up, so I tried to contain my enthusiasm, and I went across the hall and asked Charlie's administrative assistant if he was in. She said he was. And I said, tell him to come across the hall. I have something that he'll want to see. And as you all know, Charlie was a Civil War specialist, which I never was. So anyway, we examined these scrapbooks, which had about 500 watercolors in them, captioned by the soldier. And we managed to acquire these with funds provided by Floyd Gottwald of Richmond. So then we decided, well, let's find out more about who this Sneeden guy was. So in conversation with David Michotte, who was the curator at the U.S. Army Museum at West Point, he said that he knew of a Sneeden's Landing in New York. We knew that Sneeden was from New York. And he knew of a Sneeden's Landing that was some miles downriver from West Point and a little bit north of New York City. So we found out that Sneeden's Landing was in Rockland County, New York, and we connected ourselves to the county historian. Well, she was a 90-year-old lady named Alice Monroe Hogginson. And she knew all about Sneeden. And so I told her we had acquired these wonderful scrapbooks. And she said, well, do you know about the diaries? And I was confused. I thought she was talking about the scrapbooks that we had already acquired. And she said, no, that's not what I mean. She said, in addition to the scrapbooks, Sneeden left a 5,000-page multi-volume diary, also illustrated with hundreds of additional watercolors of the Civil War. And I, of course, expressed great interest in this, and she had a lead on the owner, who was descended from the nephew to whom Sneeden had originally left his collection. Well, this gentleman lived in upstate New York, but he said the diaries were in a mini storage unit outside Tucson, Arizona. And he said he was willing to go to Tucson and get them to show them to us, but he had no money. He said he had no credit cards, he couldn't fly out there. Was willing to drive out there and get them and bring them to show them to us if we would pay his expenses. So we agreed to do this. And after several weeks, we didn't hear from him. And we thought maybe he had just taken our money and absconded. But then one day he did show up at the port cachere of the Virginia Historical Society, which is no longer there. But he pulled up in his car with his New York plates, and surprisingly, on the back, a Confederate flag bumper sticker, and the 5 volumes of diaries illustrated with 400 watercolors. I said something to him about it, and he said, "I'm a contrarian. I like to upset people. When I go south, everybody hates me because of my New York plates. And when I go back up to New York, everybody hates me because I have a Confederate bumper sticker on my car." He just seemed to like people disliking him, so who knows? Anyway, these diaries that he then brought us to see, and which we acquired with another gift from Floyd Gottwald, they had been unlocated since the 1880s. When they were lent to Century Magazine, which at that time was publishing a multi-volume series called Battles and Leaders of the Civil War. Now, some 36 drawings based on Sneeden had appeared in that Battles and Leaders series. All of them, however, the drawings had been redrawn by Century Magazine's stable of illustrator engravers. Well, unfortunately, one of the volumes, when it was on loan to Century Magazine, burned up in a fire. And unfortunately, that was the volume that covered the Peninsula Campaign here in Virginia, from Fair Oaks to Malvern Hill. And so those were lost to us. But fortunately, we still had the scrapbook images, many of which were duplicate images of the diary ones. In 1974, American Heritage acquired the Century Magazine collection, which brought Sneeden's name to light. And people started for the first time wondering, whatever happened to those diaries that we knew about 100 years earlier? Well, of course, as I say, they did come to light. We did acquire them. And we also, when we bought them, we paid a little bit extra to the gentleman and said, we want to purchase not only the physical diaries, but the right to publish them, the rights to publish them. So we threw in a little sweetener to the deal, and he agreed to that. I should say that this is really more of a memoir than a diary, strictly speaking. Sneeden shipped items home throughout the war, including the day before his capture. He made coded notes and images even when he was in Andersonville prison, and said that he prioritized paper over food at Andersonville so that he could continue drawing. After the Civil War, beginning in the 1870s, Sneeden, who was an architectural draftsman, work was drying up for him. And he tried to expand he decided, I'm going to try to expand my memoir of my diaries from the Civil War into a complete illustrated history of the war. And then he started adding scenes of battles where he had never been present, such as Gettysburg. Some of these he copied from Battles and Leaders, but still 90% of his drawings that we have are original. The VHS wanted to publish these diaries. I mean, we recognized this was an unpublished, tremendous source of Civil War history. Our editor, Nelson Langford, whom some of you may know, has Nelson spoken here? I think. Nelson's coming here to speak on his book on Richmond after the burning, after the surrender in April 1865. Well, Nelson worked with Charlie and I at the Historical Society. He was the editor of the magazine. He knew a woman, Alice Everett, who in turn knew a leading New York City literary person named Julian Bach. And Mr. Bach believed that this literary property was so valuable that it was worth conducting a literary auction. So over the phone, he conducted an auction, and he took bids from New York publishers who bid against each other for the rights to publish the Sneeden Diary. And the winning bid was from the Free Press, a division of Simon & Schuster, and they got the rights to publish the book for $364,000 up front, plus royalties. So we more than recovered the cost of the Sneeden diaries and scrapbooks. Well, of course, there had been technically no cost to us since Mr. Gottwald had put up the money. So the $364,000 could go into the Historical Society's endowment. Charlie here decided to take a sabbatical. He asked the board if he could have a sabbatical. He wanted to edit these diaries for publication. Being a Civil War expert and knowing that this was a unique opportunity to edit diaries, thousands of pages that of soldier testimony that had never seen the light before. A scholar rarely gets an opportunity like that. So he and Nelson edited the book. I did not edit. I was not one of the editors, but I did come up with the title, Eye of the Storm, little double entendre there. When the book came out, for one day, and I believe it was January the 1st, 2001, the first day of the new millennium, okay? For that one day, Eye of the Storm here was the #1 selling book in the world. Back in the days when Amazon sold mainly books, they had 3 million titles for sale, and Eye of the Storm was the #1 selling book for just one day, but still, it was a distinction. And the book sold so well that the publishers came to us and said, we want a second book because we've only published a fraction of the watercolors and so forth. We want a second book. Can you rush it out because we want it to be out by Christmas so that people can buy the second book as a Christmas present? So they only gave us a few months. And in order to expedite things, I joined the team. So on the second book, I was one of the 3 editors, and that one's called Images from the Storm. And so we got that out. Then we organized a traveling exhibit of Sneeden. And naturally, because he was from New York, not far from New York City, we took our exhibit to the New York Historical Society. Well, this was late in 2001, and when we opened the exhibit at the New York Historical Society on Central Park West, you could still see the smoldering smoke from the World Trade Center that had just been destroyed a couple of months before. So anyway, the 900 watercolors that were made in wartime as pencil sketches originally were recopied later, made into full watercolors, and as far as we know, the original sketches destroyed. But this is the most complete description of the Civil War experience we have by any single individual soldier. So let's look at the images themselves. This, of course, is Sneeden as a young man, and these are pictures of the volumes in which all of this material now appears, and up there in the upper right, a sketch Sneeden of himself. This is Sneeden's Landing. Sneeden's Landing, New York. This drawing is not in the Virginia Historical Society collection. This is at the New York Historical Society. At the left are the Palisades of the Hudson. The landing is named for Sneeden's family, which operated a ferry to Westchester County across the Hudson. They were loyalists in the American Revolution who moved to Nova Scotia, and Sneeden was born in Nova Scotia in 1832, but he returned to New York City in 1850. He worked in the architecture trade, but what schooling or training he had is unknown. Producing drawings of buildings was an expected part of the business. He struggled, however, with human figures. When some of his images appeared in battles and leaders of the Civil War in the late 1880s, the engravers improved his human figures. This is a view of Fort Lyon in Alexandria, Virginia, and Fort Ellsworth, done in October 1861. He joined a regiment in New York, the 7th, I think it was. Is that right, Charlie? 7th Regiment. And after his regiment left New York, he remained in New York City to help clean up the armory. He rejoined the 40th New York Volunteers at Alexandria. His regiment was called the Mozart Regiment after Mozart Hall, the headquarters of a faction of New York City's Democratic Party. Tammany Hall was another, of course, of those factions. Fort Ellsworth, here in this picture, was named for Oliver Ellsworth, who, as you may know, was a young officer who went into the Marshall House in Alexandria, climbed up to the top to take the Confederate flag down, and the owner of the hotel shot him on his way down and became one of the first Union officers to die in the Civil War. And Ellsworth had been a friend of Lincoln's and so forth. This is view of Munson's Hill from Bailey's Crossroads, Virginia, September 1861. This was his first assignment in Virginia. He writes, "I went out to Bailey's Crossroads early this morning. 2 or 3 new guns had been mounted on the low parapets of the work of the enemy, while on them were several rebels with glasses who were surveying our position. Sneeden, though a private, was doing staff officer work and would do so throughout the war without any promotion or complaint." This is his view of Mount Vernon, December 23rd, 1861. A caretaker took him through the house. The caretaker said both sides, soldiers from both sides, came for visits. It had only been acquired by the Mount Vernon Ladies Association in 1858, and no real restoration had been done by 1861. Sneeden said the outhouses, kitchens, and barns were dilapidated, and the old tomb was in utter ruin. This is Major General Samuel P. Heinzelman, the commander of the 40th Division. Sneeden met him January 12, 1862. When the general got new assignments, he took Sneeden with him. This is plan of the redoubt, Mount Everin, Virginia, October, November 1861. Sneeden furnished a set of drawings for the redoubt built between the Leesburg and Fairfax turnpikes. He wrote in his diary, "A whiskey ration was issued to the men both before going to work and when the day's work was done." This is planned from Fort Monroe to Big Bethel, April 1st, 1862. So obviously, Sneeden now is part of the Peninsula Campaign, McClellan's drive up the peninsula from Yorktown and Old Fortress Monroe towards Richmond with the aim of capturing Richmond. This is a plan for the advance up the Middle Peninsula. There had been a battle at Big Bethel on June 10th, 1861. This is Howard's Bridge and ruins of Morell's Mill, Poquoson, Virginia, April 4th, 1862. The house shown at the top was McClellan's headquarters, and Sneeden lived at Howe's Sawmill. This is Union gunboats shelling Yorktown, Virginia, and Gloucester Point. Let me see if I can get from the book here a quote, if I can find it. Let's see. I went on a tour of observation today along the Wormsley Creek shores and upriver along the high bluffs. While here I saw a lively contest between two of our sidewheel gunboats and the rebel batteries at Yorktown and those of Gloucester Point. It was a charming sight to see the gunboats move in circles and fire from their heavy bow guns. Slow and with precision, their shells struck the parapets of the water battery, or battery Magruder, knocking the sandbags up in the air and dismounting a gun. There was much scampering about among the enemy's artillerymen when this took place. Shells from the gunboats burst in and on the enemy's batteries at Gloucester Point. The enemy opened fire at once, 2 from the ramparts of Yorktown, 4 or 5 from the water battery there, and 3 from the water battery below Gloucester Point. The duel lasted for 2 hours. The enemy's shots struck the water very close to the vessels, while shells burst in midair. None struck the steamers, however, which kept moving along all the while. Being on a bluff 70 feet above the York River, I had a fine view of the action. And of course, with a fine view of the action, he recorded the action as we see it here. This drawing is of the Union Army marching into Yorktown, May 4th, 1862. I'm going to quote from the diary again. The bands were now once more in full blast while the colors are flying and bright uniforms with the polished arms glistening in the morning sun looked grand and imposing. General McClellan made his headquarters in a white house at the head of the main street and nearly opposite the Nelson House. A large national flag was put up this afternoon. As the troops marched through, I made a sketch, unquote. Well, this ceremony was a bit misleading. The troops were in fact rather unhappy. Sneed wrote, quote, "The whole army were much chagrined that the enemy had so cleverly skipped out after giving us all the hard work to construct 14 batteries, corduroy numerous miles of road. It was a whole month's work for nothing. All the fine guns stood up in different batteries with ammunition piled in them for 48 hours of continuous bombardment as monuments to McClellan's imbecility and, quote, fortification on the brain. All were useless now and must be sent back to Fort Monroe. The little Napoleon stock fell very low among officers who knew anything." Well, the truth is, McClellan might have occupied Yorktown by taking it the first day he saw it, but instead he decided to besiege it, and it took a whole month. And then finally, after he finished all the fortifications ready to besiege it, the Confederates simply moved out anyway. This is what the soldiers were so frustrated about. And of course, this, in a way, is representative of the whole Peninsula Campaign, where throughout which McClellan was always convinced that he was outnumbered, although he never was. This is view of Fair Oak Station, June 15th, 1862. The so-called twin houses became Major General Joe Hooker's headquarters after the battle. After the battle, Sneed visited key sites along Union lines and made maps for General Heintzelman's after-action report. Oh, really? Railroad. Yeah, you can see the railroad track there. Let's see. All right. This is view of headquarters of Major General George McClellan at Dr. Trent's house near Savage's Station, Virginia, June 1862. After the Battle of Savage's Station, Sneed wrote, quote, "At Dr. Trent's, which has been used a second time by General McClellan as headquarters, everything betokened hasty exit," unquote. Professor Thaddeus Lowe headed the Balloon Corps. On April 9th at Yorktown, Sneed wrote, quote, Professor Lowe's balloon went up for the first time this forenoon. Thousands of soldiers swarmed out from their camps in the woods to see it. It ascended, held by 2 ropes attached to the basket car. It was only partially inflated and rose to a height of 900 feet. It was made of yellow-colored cloth varnished. On it was painted an immense head portrait of General McClellan. The ramparts of Yorktown soon swarmed with the enemy to see it, but all at once they disappeared as if by orders. Lowe and 2 officers could see, of course, inside the enemy's works, sketch the outlines of parapets, and count the guns already mounted and note their bearings. From this, the draftsman can make the maps and plans they are waiting for. So, of course, this balloon was some of the first aerial reconnaissance. The balloon corps was inexplicably abandoned in 1863, by which time the balloons could ascend more than 2,000 feet. The Battle of Savage's Station, Sunday, June 29, 1862. Sneeden writes that the dead and 2,500 wounded were abandoned on the battlefield. Battle of Malvern Hill on the James, July 1st, 1862. Despite the tactical Union victory, McClellan withdrew after the battle to the protection of his gunboats on the James River. The Old Harrison House, Berkeley's Landing, July 13th, 1862. This, of course, is the house that we know today as Berkeley Plantation, where the song Taps was written, as you probably know. This, too, was McClellan's headquarters and later was a signal station and hospital. It was the birthplace of one of the presidents of the United States. I'm going to ask you a trivia question here, which is, which 2 presidents of the United States were born on the same street as this house? Berkeley Plantation. 2 presidents were born on the street where this house is located. Anybody? Harrison and Tyler, who curiously ran as a ticket in 1840. Tippecanoe and Tyler, too. Then Tippecanoe died after giving a 2.5-hour inaugural address and catching pneumonia, and Tyler became president. So 2 presidents of the United States who ran on a ticket together, born on the same road in Virginia. Yeah. All right. This is the coal house on Ruffin's plantation. Ruffin, of course, was Edmund Ruffin, one of the Southern fire eaters from Virginia, who had asked for the privilege of firing the first shot at Fort Sumter. And in fact, the Virginia Historical Society, now Virginia Museum of History and Culture, owns the fuse wire that Edmund Ruffin lit to fire the first shot over Fort Sumter on April 12, 1861. Now you see the burning of the coal house, August 1st, 1862. Quote, at 5:30, 1,800 of our troops were assembled at Westover Wharf, who soon embarked on 3 or 4 steamers. The force steamed across, landed at the ruined wharf, deployed and went over to the coal house. This was set on fire, and soon the flames streamed out of every window and wrapped the fine dwelling in sheets of fire. The sun had just set, and the scene was grand. I made a sketch on the spot. That's what you're seeing. Correctly supposing that McClellan was not offensive-minded, Lee drew away to join Stonewall Jackson in opposing the army of General John Pope that was forming to attack via northern Virginia. Fearing for Washington, D.C., Lincoln ordered McClellan's army to leave the peninsula I think I've got the right one here. This is a headquarters team of Major General Heintzelman at Island Ford during Second Bull Run, August 30th, 1862. Quoting Sneeden again, "Our camp was on an island between the high banks on either side of the run and off the road, so we were not interrupted by wagon trains or any stragglers. The running waters of Bull Run had a very pleasant effect on our tired nerves. And while everything was hot and dusty on the hills, we were in a shady, cool spot and enjoyed our situation until we had orders to move." Then General Heintzelman was ordered to go to the District of Washington, so he moves into Washington at 15½ and Pennsylvania Avenue. On December 10th, 1862, Sneeden writes, "General Heintzelman, having assumed the command of the Department of Washington on the 1st of the month, headquarters will be transferred from here to 15½ and Pennsylvania Avenue, Washington City tomorrow." Sneeden went with Heintzelman and was out of combat for 13 months. Not quite sure why that picture is in there, but I'm going to skip over it. This is Kelly's Mill, Kelly's Ford, Rappahannock River, Virginia. The mill was captured by 3rd Corps on November 7th, 1862, and sketched on November 19th. Sneeden was ordered to make a survey of the recent battle fought there. He met Old Man Kelly, the owner of the mill, who denounced the Yankees for stealing cattle and hogs and not paying for his grain. Sneeden speaks of captured rifles that were made in Richmond, not of very good quality. This would be Confederate rifles made in Richmond. This is Miller's house, Brandy Station, Virginia, November 26, 1863. So this is after Sneeden's sojourn in D.C. When Sneeden agreed to make maps for new 3rd Corps Commander General W.L. French, he moved into upstairs of French's headquarters, the Miller House near Brandy Station. It commanded a view of the Orange and Alexandria Railroad. General French left for the Mine Run campaign. Sneeden and a few officers remained. But the 3 of them were captured that night by Mosby in person. Sneeden was captured that night by Colonel Mosby, the famous Gray Ghost, in person. Sneeden was struck with a pistol for refusing to provide information. Sneeden writes, "The rebels were nearly all young men. Some looked not more than 18 years old. They wore homemade jeans of wool, had very fine, lightly made horses, good arms, and made long marches mostly at night. All the rebels had good top boots, the plunder of some unfortunate sutler's shop or wagon." So here's a picture of Mosby. Probably the most famous view of him, obviously a studio portrait with a painted background. But this is a map showing the route that was taken by Mosby and other prisoners. Once Mosby had captured them, they were to be sent to Richmond in order to be incarcerated. They were forced to ride bareback on captured mules around the Union Army. They were turned over to authorities at Gordonsville and shipped by train to Richmond, where they arrived on the 30th of November. There's a little bit of I put a little digression in here of a couple of artifacts that now belong to the Virginia Historical Society. When I first came to work for Charlie in 1990, one of the first things I got to do happily was to meet with John Singleton Mosby's living grandson, who was then about 90 years old and living in the Fairfax retirement home in Northern Virginia. He was a retired admiral, Admiral Beverly Mosby Coleman. He had been born in 1900 and Mosby had not died till 1916. So for the first 16 years of Admiral Coleman's life, he had actually lived in the same house as Colonel Mosby did. And when I met him, he was about 90 years old, and he had artifacts that he wanted to donate. And he was looking for a proper place, and I pulled out all the stops to persuade him that the Virginia Historical Society was where he should give these things. So he did. So this, for example, is Mosby's law license to practice law in Virginia. This is Mosby's commission as a captain of partisan rangers, dated April 21st, 1862. This is Mosby's sash that he wore with his uniform coat. I don't know where these come from, but anyway. Oh, unfortunately, that should have been a painting. There was a painting I wanted to show you, but it doesn't seem to be there. Mosby's men captured a Union payroll, and they divided the money up among the Confederate men who had captured the train, the payroll. Mosby refused to take a share for himself, which increased the shares of his men. So his men all chipped in money from their shares to buy a horse for Mosby. He had admired a horse at Oatland Plantation in Northern Virginia, a horse named Coquette. And so the men bought Coquette for him, and a local artist up there painted a painting, an artist named George Porter, I believe. He did a painting of Mosby's men presenting the horse Coquette to Mosby. And that painting, which belonged to Mosby, is now at the Virginia Historical Society. So that's what this slide should be. Why it isn't there, I can't tell you. All right, so Sneeden arrives in Libby Prison, as you can see. These are other prisons in Richmond, Castle Thunder, and Pemberton Prison. Then this is called Union Prisoners Crossing the Roanoke River near Gaston, North Carolina, February 1864. Sneeden noted the poor condition of the trains. They burned no coal. They had no coal to burn, only firewood. The engineer preceded the train across the bridge to test its strength to bear the 16 railroad cars. That was a little scary to have somebody walking ahead of the train to see if the bridge is going to collapse before you go across it. And this is the ultimate destination of Sneeden the prisoner, Southgate, Andersonville Prison, Georgia. Arrived at night and the next morning wrote of the changing of the guard, quote, "We heard a rebel drum beating on the hill at 7 a.m., which was for the guard to be relieved, and soon a long file of rebel soldiers were seen coming down toward the south gate." Here's another view, Andersonville Prison, showing the fort and Wirtz's headquarters. That's up on the hill there. Sneeden notes they had no matches, no salt. They built their own shanties. Cornmeal was ground together with the cobs of corn to eat. This is a photograph of the prison at the time when Sneeden was drawing it. This is what's called the deadline at Andersonville. Sneeden claims that a man was shot by taking wood from the railing of this barrier. You weren't supposed to cross this barrier. But he says even a man who was taking wood from the railing to burn, to heat himself, was shot. This is a drawing you can see on the left of these men being hanged. This is hanging of the raiders. There were gangs at Andersonville that preyed on the weak, and many were weak because, of course, of the conditions. Sneeden writes on July 11th, 1864, "Within 10 minutes, all the bodies were swaying at the end of their ropes. After hanging about 20 minutes, they were examined and found to be dead. They laid on the ground until sunset, while hundreds of prisoners filed past abreast to see them between two rows of regulators. Their faces were much distorted. One only had his neck broken, meaning the rest had died by strangulation. All the remainder died by slow strangulation. The immense crowds of prisoners dispersed slowly to their shelters, all glad that the terrible example had been made of the murderers, while the remaining raiders, yet in the stockade, were cowed at once, and thieving, robbery, and murder stopped for a time." Another view of Andersonville Prison taken from Wirtz's headquarters, looking back down the hill, September 17, 1864. Well, then Sneeden finally left Andersonville, and his next prison was near Florence, South Carolina. This was one of the stops along the way for him to be exchanged, paroled in exchange for a Confederate soldier. He was only at this prison pen in Florence for a week. On arrival, to ensure his place in the exchange of prisoners, he noted, "I was dressed better than any of the officers present and put on all the assurance of an important person in order to give himself more of a chance of being at the front of the line to be exchanged." This one is said, exchange of 10,000 Union prisoners of war under a flag of truce, Charleston, South Carolina. Sneeden writes, "Soon we descried our fleet of transport steamers with large white flags at the fore for the mass prisoner exchange in Charleston Harbor. Note the stars and stripes at the peak, and three feeble chairs were raised by us, which was responded to by waving of handkerchiefs from our vessels," that is, the vessels that were coming to pick them up. The steamer New York was the flagship of the Union Commission, and the name on our paddle boxes was enough to raise our spirits because, of course, Sneeden and many of the others from the unit were New Yorkers. And here, the U.S. steamer Varuna off Cape Hatteras, December 12, 1865. He says there were 600 passengers. The vessel was later sold to the Prince of Korea and sunk in a typhoon off the coast of China. But while Sneeden was on it, it arrived in Brooklyn, New York on Christmas Eve, 1864. And Sneeden made his way back to his family, which had not heard from him in ages and presumed that he was dead. This is an engraving of Andersonville that appeared in Frank Leslie's illustrated newspaper, October 21, 1865. This was the first engraving to be based on one of Sneeden's wartime drawings. And it was published at the height of the publicity for the trial of the Andersonville commander, Henry Wirtz. And this is a photograph of the execution of Henry Wirtz, the only Confederate officer who was actually executed as a result of the Civil War, was the commandant of Andersonville Prison. Well, as I said, after the war, Sneeden's business did not thrive, and finally, he designed little cottages. He did some work, but he never married. He had no wife. He had no children. When he finally became destitute, having used up his mother's little resources when she died, he was forced to move into the Old Soldiers' Home at Bath, New York in 1905, and then 13 years later, he died. But he did leave us this with ribbons here of all the engagements in which he was present. For a private soldier, I like to call him the Forrest Gump of the Civil War. I mean, he was everywhere, really. He was at all these important places, and he never rose above the rank of private. But he writes on here, "I leave no posterity but a good war record." And these diaries and scrapbooks keep giving. A couple of years ago, maybe 10 years ago now, some archaeology finally uncovered Camp Millen, Georgia, one of the places where Sneeden had been briefly incarcerated. And they had never known where it was. And now they found it, but everybody lamented that they had no images of it. Nobody knew what it looked like. They only had remnants of the post holes in the ground, but Sneeden had recorded it. Even though he was only there for a week, he did drawings of it, And those people in Georgia then had a basis on which to do a reconstruction of the camp for visitors. So I like to think that Sneeden's truth goes marching on. Thank you. Any questions? Yes, sir.
Do we know if they intended for Sneeden to always go to Andersonville, i.e. Richmond was just a way station, or it became too overcrowded and they shipped them down there, or what?
I don't really know the answer to that. Charlie might know more. Do you? There were pretty substantial numbers incarcerated in Richmond, but
Andersonville was built with having in mind that it would hold 10,000 prisoners. It eventually got up to 30,000. So they were vastly overcrowded. And that all the Confederate camps became overcrowded.
I've been to Andersonville. That was a terrible place. How long was Sneeden there?
yeah, I don't remember without, I'd have to go back and look at the diary, but it wasn't a brief period of time at all. I'd say it was 6, 9 months, even 9 months, maybe 6, 9.
A lot of people
good stretch
died.
of time.
A lot of people died there.
He was lucky not to. I mean, the majority of people did. Yeah. And I don't know whether he's bragging or not, but he did write later. He said, when I had a choice, I took paper over food because he wanted to be able to continue to do his drawings.
It's remarkable that he was able to do this and keep all this stuff intact.
Well, I don't think literally the sketches that whatever, in those days, a lot of times an artist didn't really draw they'd make a note saying house was here or barn was here, little notes to themselves. Obviously, Sneeden did not have watercolors in Andersonville. Whatever he was able to do was just sketched out on paper. And after the war, he took these things. But as you say, it is remarkable he even was able to keep the paper sketches. But he would then work them up from his memory and from his notes and so forth into full-scale watercolor drawings. They were redrawn after the war. But it is amazing that that as much of his stuff survives. It really is.
I didn't mention something else about the Sneeden collection. There are so many views of little towns and villages that we have no image of until Sneeden came along. This is a great aid to architectural historians. Another thing, Civil War is often called the first modern war. Steam engines, telegraph, but it's also the first visual war. It's the first time that the average Joe could see an engraved image. They had no idea what George Washington looked like when he was younger. But this is first visual war.
But this was much more true of the North than the South. The North had publications like Harper's Weekly and Frank Leslie's Illustrated Magazine, who sent reporters who also could draw to the South to sketch these battles, and then they'd send their pictures back to New York, and engravers would engrave them, and they would then appear in next week's issue of Frank Leslie's magazine. The South had almost nothing of that sort. They occasionally could smuggle through some picture that was 8 months old from maybe the London Illustrated News or something like that, but they didn't have the same recourse to imagery that, and of course, as you know, even some of the famous Civil War photographers like Brady exhibited their works in galleries during the war. The famous views of the dead at Antietam, for example. So war, which art in the past had tended to glorify war, photography didn't do that. It showed it much more realistically, you know. Yeah. Other questions? All right. Well, thank you.